Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to unpack the invisible blueprint that guides absolutely everything you do in society. Today, we're explaining the chapter on culture and socialization, and we're going to break down exactly how you, me, and everyone else navigates the human experience. So here's our map for today's journey. We'll start by defining what culture actually is with the invisible map. Then we'll see how environments shape cultures, look at the three dimensions of culture, dive into identity and clashing cultures, and finally finish up with how cultures change. But before we get into the heavy definitions, I want you to think about something for a second. Think about that awkward split-second panic of not knowing whether to shake hands, bow, or nod when you meet a total stranger from a different background. That right there, that brief, uncomfortable moment of hesitation, that is you missing the cultural map. It's an unwritten code we rely on every single day, and most of the time we don't even realize we're using it. All right, moving to section 1, the invisible map, what is culture? Let's officially define this thing. It's actually fascinating to look back at how the early British anthropologist Edward Tylor defined culture way back in 1871. He called it that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So the absolute key takeaway here is that culture isn't just about having, refined, elite tastes in classical music or fancy paintings. Not at all. It's a complex whole of everyday habits that we pick up simply by participating in a society. It is literally the water we swim in. And building on that idea, decades later, anthropologist Clifford Geertz brilliantly described humans as animals suspended in self-spun webs of significance. I just love that phrasing. He takes culture to be those exact webs. It really shows that culture is fundamentally how we make sense of our world. We spin these giant webs of meaning and then, we just live inside them. Section 2. Environments shape diverse cultures, adapting to the map. Let's look at how the physical geography of the world literally forces us to draw very different cultural blueprints. Think about it. If you live in a river valley, your environment necessitates an entirely different way of life. It completely dictates your community cooperation, your modes of transport, and your core survival strategies. Your entire culture has to adapt to the waterfront. Now, contrast that with navigating endless desert dunes. Out here, a boat is completely useless, right? Instead, mobility and animal husbandry, specifically relying on caravans of camels, those become the absolute core of the culture. The harsh, dry environment is essentially writing the rulebook for how that society must function just to survive. And then you've got freezing, mountainous terrains. Up there, the architecture, the tools, the daily habits, they all must uniquely adapt to harsh cold and extreme isolation. Basically, every natural setting on Earth demands a completely different cultural toolkit. So, does that mean one toolkit is better than another? Well, get this. During the devastating 2004 tsunami, modern mainlanders and islanders who were integrated into a relatively modern way of life suffered massive devastation and a huge loss of life. But quote-unquote primitive tribal communities in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, like the Anjis and Jarawas, they actually saved themselves. They had zero modern technology, but they used their experiential knowledge of nature to literally read the signs of the calamity and move to higher ground before it hit. This brilliantly illustrates that no culture is universally superior to another. They can really only be judged as adequately or inadequately adapted to cope with the specific strains of their own natural environment. Which brings us to section 3, three dimensions of culture: the cognitive, normative, and material. Let's zoom in and look at the actual construction of these maps. Sociologists generally break culture down into three distinct dimensions. First, there's the cognitive dimension. That's how we process information to give it meaning, like instantly recognizing your specific cell phone ringtone in a crowded room. Then there's the normative dimension, which is all about our rules of conduct, like knowing you really shouldn't open someone else's mail. And finally, the material dimension. This includes our tangible tools and tech, which could be anything from a simple rice flour paste used for floor designs all the way up to internet chat rooms. Let's actually look a little closer at that normative dimension, because these rules are almost always unspoken. For example, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu points out that implicit normative rules strictly dictate gift-giving. If you return a gift to someone too quickly, it actually looks like you're trying to dodge a debt rather than showing polite gratitude. It's kind of funny when you think about it, but we follow these incredibly complex social norms constantly, mostly because we're socialized to do so right from childhood. But what's really fascinating is what happens when these dimensions fall out of sync.
For a culture to function smoothly, the material and non-material dimensions have to work together. But when our material tools advance incredibly fast and our normative rules and values just can't keep up, we experience what sociologists call culture lag. Just think about how incredibly fast smartphones evolved versus how long it's actually taking society to figure out the polite, normative rules for using them at a dinner table. Okay, Section 4, Identity and Clashing Cultures, Subcultures, and the Meeting of Maps. This is where we explore how our cultural map gives us our sense of identity, and what happens when totally different maps collide.
You know, within any giant overarching culture, you've always got these smaller, cohesive units called subcultures. And these groups give their members a very specific identity. They're usually marked by distinct speech patterns, unique dress codes, shared music tastes, or even private spaces. Whether we're talking about an elite youth group or a working-class neighborhood club, these subcultures create their own little world of meanings. They basically differentiate themselves from everybody else to build a positive self-image through the recognition of their peers.
Now, when different overarching cultures come into contact with one another, we generally see one of two reactions. The first is ethnocentrism. This is when you evaluate another culture based entirely on your own cultural standards, often projecting your own values as superior. This was heavily evident in colonial situations, like when the East India Company sought to create a class of people who were Indian in blood but English in tastes and morals. The opposite of this is cosmopolitanism. A cosmopolitan outlook doesn't evaluate or judge. It actually values other cultures for their differences. It accommodates diverse influences and actively promotes cultural exchange. And honestly, this is just a fantastic example of cosmopolitanism in action, the phenomenon of Hinglish. Rather than completely closing its doors to foreign influence, the culture seamlessly blends the English language with local Indian context to create something entirely new, and now globally recognized. Just look at these examples. You've got Airdash for traveling by air, Propone, which is genius, to bring a meeting forward, Stepney for a spare tire, Time Pass for an activity to kill time, and the relatively new verb Bangalored, used when a job is outsourced to India. The absorption of these diverse styles doesn't destroy the original culture, it actually enriches it, providing a totally unique cosmopolitan identity. Finally, Section 5, How Cultures Change, Redrawing the Map. For our last section, we have to understand that these cultural maps, they're never actually finished. They are dynamic, living things that are constantly being redrawn. Societal patterns change in two primary ways. First, you have evolutionary change. This is a slow, gradual adaptation, kind of like an agrarian community slowly adopting new methods of farming that eventually boost production and change their entire way of life, but over generations. The second is revolutionary change. This happens when a culture is transformed rapidly, and its entire value and meaning system undergoes a radical overhaul. A prime example from history is the 1789 French Revolution, which rapidly destroyed the old ranking system and inculcated entirely new societal values of liberty, equality, and fraternity overnight. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question directly from our source material to ponder about our own current cultural map. Think about the massive, totally unprecedented expansion of modern media over recent years. Has this constant connectivity and instant access to information brought about a slow, evolutionary change to our cognitive culture? Or are we experiencing a total, radical revolution of our societal values? How is your map being redrawn right now? That is absolutely something for you to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the invisible webs around you.